All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Singing Frogs with the Mass Audubon. One sure sign of spring is the sound of singing frogs. Why do frogs sing? Learn the different frogs found in Massachusetts, as well as how to identify them by their calls. Explore how frogs can be very sensitive to pollution and climate change and can be a strong indicator of how healthy an environment is. And we're going to wrap up with information on Frogwatch, which is a community science project in which individuals can monitor populations by documenting their sounds. And so today's presentation is led by Patti Steinman, who is the education coordinator for Mass Audubon's Connecticut River Valley Sanctuaries, based out of Arcadia in Easthampton and Northampton. She has worked at Mass Audubon for 30 years, developing and overseeing programs for families, adults, and children. We again thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring, and I will be thanking the partnering libraries at the end. So all 125 of us that are watching live and all those that will watch the recording on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Patti for joining us this afternoon. And Patti, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you everybody for coming on this beautiful day. So, and Robert, you were warning them of some of the questions. I thought you were going to say that I was going to give them a test, which we kind of are. We're going to ask you some questions at the end, but as Robert said, no pressure at all. It's all in fun. So this is about frogs. So we have two frogs over here. The first one is a leopard frog, and the next one is a wood frog. And we'll learn all about these in just a few minutes. But I'm just going to play a recording right over here of some frogs. So there were 3 different frogs that we're calling there, 3 different species, and we'll go over all of those in just a minute. But that was like a spring day in New England. And today we'll go over a little introduction, learn a little bit about frogs, learn why frogs sing. We'll meet the frogs that live in Massachusetts. And then we'll talk a little bit about that community science being ways that any one of us, those 3rd graders in, I think Robert said Sunderland, or anybody else can participate in research, environmental research that really helps the natural world. So really, really important to be able to have people doing that. We can learn an awful lot. I can't say enough for that. So frogs are amphibians. And in fact, in the chat, if you want to put, there's only one other amphibian that lives in Massachusetts besides frogs. And I should say besides frogs and toads. So if you want to just put that in the chat, the other type of amphibian that we have. And Robert, if you can let me know, that'd be great.
All right, Patti, I think there's a consensus. There's some interesting spellings. Does spelling count, Patti?
No, it doesn't.
All right, I'm going to go with salamanders.
That you are absolutely right. If spelling counted, then I would not pass either. But it is the salamanders. So we have frogs and salamanders as amphibians. And they have 2 life stages. So a larval stage. In the case of a frog, we would know that as tadpoles, and then an adult stage. They're vertebrates, meaning they have backbones, just like us. They're ectotherms, which is a fancy word for cold-blooded. Doesn't mean their blood is cold, but it means that whatever the temperature is outside, that's what their body temperature is. That's why these amphibians, reptiles, are cold-blooded or ectotherm as well. That's why they need to hibernate during the winter time. So if their blood was 20 degrees, they certainly wouldn't be able to function. Frogs breathe through their gills or lungs, and in some cases, some amphibians will breathe through their skin. Some frogs can actually take in air through their skin, and a lot of salamanders will breathe through their skin. Frogs lay eggs, and usually all amphibians will lay eggs in water, although there are some that will on land. They're in the order of Anura, which means it's Latin for without tail. So worldwide, there are 5,000 species. In Massachusetts, we have 10. And there's 9 families of frogs. And in Massachusetts, we have 4. So each of these families has different and unique characteristics. So the true frogs are what we think of as the pond frogs. So those are the ones that are really good jumpers. So they're the ones that, like the green frog and the bullfrog, that we might find in ponds and lakes. And again, excellent jumpers, long back feet. The true toads actually lack teeth, and they have thick skin, and they have short hind legs. They can actually be seen crawling just as much as they are hopping, and they're not as good. If you were going to have a race, which frog could hop the furthest or the highest, you'd want to go with those true frogs, not the toads. Then we have tree frogs, and many people are probably familiar with the spring peeper, which is an example of a tree frog. They are pretty small. They're arboreal, which means that they can be found living on trees. Often you find them a lot by lakes and ponds, and they're in the shrubs. They have rounded little adhesive discs on their feet. Their feet are, or their toes, I should say, are not webbed, and they can be found with those little discs. They can be found hanging on, it's almost like little Velcro. So I know I found them on my porch. I've seen them certainly on trees. You may see them on your house, maybe on your school, but those are the little tree frogs, which includes the spring peeper. And then the last family that we have in Massachusetts is the spadefoot family. And we only have one of these, and that's what this picture is over here. This is the spadefoot toad. So these are nocturnal, meaning they're active at night. They have a vertical eye pupil that you can see in this picture. They have smooth skin, and they have teeth only on the upper jaw. And we'll get into all 10 of these in just a few minutes. So a big question is, well, what about the toads? So at the bottom here, we can see that all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. So that simply means that a toad is a type of a frog. So just as we saw in the families, the true toads and the spadefoot are families in the order Anura. So generally, the frogs are the ones that have long legs, and their legs are longer than their head and body. The frogs have smooth, shiny skin. They lay eggs in clumps, so in big kind of rounded clumps and in masses. Whereas the toads, they have shorter legs. As I mentioned before, they prefer to crawl. They have dry, warty skin. You cannot get warts from a toad at all. They do have poison glands or parotenoid glands. So it is poisonous if you were holding a toad, and if it were to release some of these toxins in its glands, you certainly wouldn't want to eat it. If you were to touch your finger maybe to your mouth, it would not taste very good. If it was an animal, maybe a bird, a great blue heron, that were to eat the toad, it certainly could get sick. So as long as you don't eat the toads, I think you'll be fine. And the poisonous glands are, of course, to protect them. So they're an adaptation. The toads are found more on land, and they lay their eggs in a string. So we're going to see the eggs in this next picture. So here on the left, we can see the picture of the frog eggs, and those are wood frog eggs. Some of you may be familiar with vernal pools, temporary bodies of water, where there are certain amphibians, such as the wood frog, needs to live in this vernal pool. It dries up during the summertime. It doesn't have any fish in it. So this is actually a picture of wood frog eggs in a vernal pool. They also can look very much like spotted salamander eggs. In the right, that string in the water, that's actually the American toad eggs. So it almost looks like a big snake in the water, but it's not. It's a string, and each little piece of that contains an egg. So there's hundreds of eggs in both of these. Unfortunately, not all of them will make it, but there's definitely lots and lots of eggs. So we're going to go through the life cycle of the frog over here. And so they start off as an egg, and then in the egg, each one of those in that clump or in the chain, there's a whole bunch, so there's hundreds. And then we can see that little picture. It looks like two eyes, and those are two individual eggs that will turn into two tadpoles. The tadpoles live in the water and have a tail, and they actually can store food in that tail, and they can live off of that food. And then eventually the tail disappears. It gets absorbed, I should say. And we begin to see some of the feet developing. At this point, when the frogs are little, we can call them little froglets, or you could just say a young frog. It gets bigger and bigger, and eventually it's an adult frog. Some frogs, it takes a few years for them to get to be a really big frog. Some of them can do it in one season. So it depends on what the frog is. So talking about breeding is important because the time when we hear the frogs, we're focusing today on sounds. So most of the time when we're hearing frogs, it's during the mating season. So it's when they're mating, when they're getting ready to lay eggs, so that certainly their generation and their species can continue. When frogs breed or they're mating, it's called implexus. And what basically happens is a male frog will advertise, so it will call, and then it will jump onto a female frog, and it will hold on with its front feet, and then she will lay eggs. It's all external fertilization, so no internal fertilization at all. So completely external. She will lay her eggs, and then he'll leave his sperm on top of her eggs, and then they will develop. Some frogs have what we call explosive breeding. So an example is the wood frog when they live in a vernal pool. So remember that vernal pool dries up in the summertime. So explosive breeders means all the adult ones of breeding age come to the pond. Sometimes it can be within hours. Sometimes it can be within a day or two. So they'll all come into the pond, and then the males will be calling, and then they'll be breeding. And in the case of explosive breeders, the males and the females, after laying eggs, they'll go right back to where they came from. So in the case of the wood frog, it goes right back into the woods. So they do not stay around. Then there's prolonged breeders. So that would be like the bullfrog or the green frog. And that means that they have a longer period to be breeding. So some of the males will come to the pond one day, other males will come another day. This could go on for weeks. It can even go on throughout the summer, depending on the type of frog. So the advantage to prolonged breeders means that the frog can get bigger and therefore less apt to be prone to predators before it needs to leave the pond. So advantages to both explosive and prolonged, depending on what type of frog you are. So the big question, why do frogs vocalize, or why do they call? So each of them has an identifiable advertisement call or breeding call. This is the one that we're most likely to hear, and this is the one that takes place in the spring. So the advertisement call is always given by the males, and it's basically announcing to the females, hey, I'm a male frog, I've got a beautiful habitat, or I've got a beautiful territory, I've got the best territory, and I'm the best male frog. So advertising for a mate. What's interesting is in the advertisement calls, if you're by a pond, you'll notice that they don't necessarily all call at the same time. Sometimes they have to take a little break. They can call, a male frog rather, can call hundreds of thousands of times in one night. So that takes an awful lot of energy to be calling. And scientists have studied this, and they've defined that it's very much worth it for them to be doing that, even though it's a lot of energy, and even though they may be prone to predators out there. If they breed successfully, it's certainly all worth it. So there's those advertisement calls, and we'll go over those for each different frog in just a few minutes. Then there's the aggressive or the territorial call. And those can be grunts or growls, sometimes a type of a trill. And these are given by the male, and again, in defending its territory. Then there's the release call. So this is like usually chirp type calls. Sometimes the body will vibrate, and this can be given if a male jumps on top of another male, or it can be given if a male jumps on top of a female who doesn't want him there. Then there's the rain call, which is kind of like the advertisement call, a little bit weaker, and this is given after rainstorms. And then there's the alarm call. And if there's anybody out there who's captured a frog, sometimes they'll give this high-pitched squeak, and you may just drop the frog. You may be so startled by that call. And that's exactly what it wants you to do. Or it wants, basically, if a predator picks it up, it gives that call so that the predator will drop it. So the vocal sac is something which, that's at the thing in the picture up above, that little pouch over there that enhances the sound of the frog. So it's basically a loose pouch of skin that inflates with air and acts as a resonating chamber that intensifies the sound. The males have those so that they can send their sound out so that it goes further and it can be heard as far away as it can. In some cases, some frogs can be heard for over a mile. So the frog draws in air through its nostrils, and it inflates its lungs and its mouth, it inflates its lungs. And then what happens is it seals off its nostrils and mouth and expels the air from the lungs into the larynx, or its vocal sac. And then the frog continues to call, and the muscle forces air back and forth between the lungs and the vocal sacs, and it all results in those beautiful sounds. we can see that there's 3 different types of vocal sacs. So there's the single one on the top, the paired ones on each side, and then an internal one. This is like the outer ear of the frog, and it's called the tympanum. And it's important for the frog to have this so that the sound can go from there into the inner ear. And since frogs are so dependent and their life cycle is really dependent on sound, they need to have these big outer ears. If you look at this picture over here, you can see these outer ears, those round things. And if you look at that, you can see that it's bigger than their eyes. So with some types of frogs, including the bullfrog and the green frog, which this is a picture of, if that outer ear, that round thing, is bigger than their eye, then it's usually a male. If it's smaller than the eye, then it's usually the female. So it's not going to happen with all frogs, but with the bullfrog and the green frog, that's the case. So that's a way that you can tell the males and the females. So things that will affect the calling of a frog is the time of year. So we hear most of the calling in the springtime, and then throughout the summer, but mostly during the spring, because remember, it's all about breeding. We usually hear them mostly sunset to about midnight. So precipitation, if it's raining, we tend to hear them more. The temperature, the lower the temperature, the slower the call. The size of the individual. So if it's a bigger frog, like a bullfrog, then it's usually a lower sound. So the bullfrog does almost like a rogarum type call, whereas a spring peeper, which is smaller, has a higher pitched call. And then there's acoustic interference. So there's some evidence that suggests that frogs try calling higher when there's human objects. So if there's cell towers or something that might be in the way, they want their call to be higher to try to get over those so that the human objects are not affecting their calling. And now we're going to start with the frogs that live in Massachusetts. So I'm going to ask you to put right in the chat, if you can just list any frog that you think lives in Massachusetts. And Robert, I just turned on my chat so I can see. So I have Kermit, I like that. Wood frogs, bullfrogs, spring peeper, bullfrogs again. Gray tree frog. Okay, excellent. So you got, whoops, let me read this one. Somebody has spring peepers, bullfrogs, wood frogs, leopard frogs, green frogs. I think we may have said all of them. Let's see. So we have the one I think we missed, the eastern spadefoot toad, the American toad, the Fowler's toad, spring peeper, I know people got, gray tree frog, bullfrog, green frog, wood frog, pickerel frog, and northern leopard frog. So good job, everybody. So when do they call? We can see in this chart that it's really March through July is the majority of the frog calls. The eastern spadefoot toad, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, but they start in March and they go right through September. Those toads only come out during thunderstorms. So we're apt to have more thunderstorms in July, August, and September. So there's normally a sequence. So the wood frogs and the spring peepers, they're pretty cold tolerant. In fact, wood frogs actually produce their own antifreeze. They can freeze and defrost. In fact, they're the northernmost frog of all frogs in North America. So they come out early. They can be seen in the vernal pools before the ice has melted. Sometimes you can see them hopping around in the snow. So the wood frogs and the peepers are the first. Then as it gets warmer, late March, early April, like this year, we had some 90-degree days. And though I think that was in early April, and all of these species, with the exception of the spadefoot toad, came out. So it depends on the season, but early ones, peeper and wood frog, then they usually, most of them come out in March. So now we're going to go through each of the frogs that live in Massachusetts. So here's the wood frog. Sometimes people call it a bandit frog. It looks like it has a little mask on its face, thus the name bandit frog. As I mentioned, this is the one that lives in vernal pools. So it is the first one to come out, sometimes right along with the spring peeper, but those two would be the first ones. This is the one that I was saying, it can produce its own antifreeze, so it can actually freeze solid. Scientists have actually done experiments where they've put these frogs in the freezer, they've frozen, and then when they bring them out, they can just defrost. So pretty amazing adaptations. So this is one of those explosive breeders. They come out in the spring, they go to the vernal pool, and doesn't sound like what you would think of as a frog. They quack. So their advertisement call sounds like a duck. So here is their quacking. That was the wood frog. And here's two wood frogs, and on the left and then to the right, we have the wood frog eggs, again in a clump. Our second frog is the spring peeper. So probably one that several people have heard. And the spring peeper can be identified because it has the X on its back. So X marks the spot for the spring peeper. We can see the one on the right with its vocal sac inflated. So this frog is definitely calling. And we know that this one would be a male because it has the vocal sac and again calling. So the spring peepers, as I mentioned, usually start calling in March. And unlike the wood frog, they can continue to be calling throughout the season. And you can hear spring peepers calling literally every month of the year. They're certainly not going to be in a chorus, but if you went for a winter walk, you might hear one or two if it was a warmer day, and maybe if you disturbed it. So some people have done something. If you try to find a spring peeper, they're only about maybe 2 inches in length. They're pretty small. You're going to certainly find them in the water, but you can also find them on the shrubs and on the trees. And if you're by a pond and you hear lots of them, and if you are with someone else and you take a flashlight and on the count of 3, you point your flashlight beam to where you think one of them is calling. That's what's called triangulation. And where the beam crosses, there's a good chance that you'll see a spring peeper there. So this is the spring peeper. And if everybody could unmute, which I know you aren't able to, and if I were to ask you to do a chorus of spring peepers, I bet you would certainly be able to do the peeper call. Sometimes, so we hear that peep, 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 that again can be given hundreds of thousands of times a night. Sometimes you may hear peep, peep, peep. So it's almost like a 2-syllable, and that's usually the aggressive call of the peeper. And there is the spring peeper. Our next one is the gray tree frog. So this is one where most frogs, it's hard to tell the difference between the male and the female, or the young and the adult. But the really young frog, I should say, the tadpoles, we can tell. But when a frog is pretty young, it's often hard to tell the difference other than size. But with the gray tree frog, if it's a young adult, it's green in color. So the one on the right would be a young gray tree frog. They're also considered to be the chameleons of the frog world. They can change color to whatever their environment is. So that is an adaptation. So probably a word that those third graders have been hearing before, an adaptation, something that helps it to survive in its habitat. So if you can have a gray tree frog, which is very gray. You can have a gray tree frog that's maybe hanging on to some woodland vegetation, so it's brown, or you can have some that are greenish, maybe not quite as green as the young ones, but certainly like a greenish in color. And these are in the tree frog family. So you can see that they have those little suction cups and that they can hold on to vegetation. I have heard in the past, maybe 10 years, more and more gray tree frogs. I think that they're becoming more and more common. So, and the sound of the gray tree frog, if anybody's familiar with a red-bellied woodpecker, the sound is going to be very similar to that bird. So here is the gray tree frog. Some of you may have noticed there was another frog at the beginning of that sound, and that was the spring peeper. And there's our gray tree frog. They also can give a courtship, a long trill, and they can give an aggressive call, which is almost like a whoop type call. Then we're going to get into some of our frog lookalikes. So the picture on the left is the green frog, and the picture on the right is the bullfrog. Now you may be looking at this and think, well, the one on the right has a lot more spots. And sorry about that, my screen just temporarily disappeared, but it's back. But both of these frogs can be very greenish, and they can also be very mottled or have those spots. The green frog, the one on the left, has those lateral lines. So you can see a line going from the eye all the way down to the side. So that's the green frog, and the one on the right is the bullfrog. Both of these are found in permanent bodies of water, in lakes and in ponds. The bullfrog is a big predator. It eats basically anything it can get its mouth on. It can eat snakes, it can eat crayfish, it can eat dragonflies, it can even eat small birds. So we're going to listen now to the first one is going to be the green frog, and this is the one that sounds like a banjo. Hope you could hear that banjo there. The bullfrog being the largest of frogs, and I should say that the green frog is a close second, but the bullfrog has that high call, almost sounding like it's saying "Uragarum, uragarum." Okay, so there's those two frogs. Our second set of lookalikes are the leopard frog on the left and the pickerel frog on the right. So these are both medium-sized frogs, and they do look very, very similar. The pickerel frog has the blotches or the spots on the pickerel frog are more irregular. than the leopard frog. So the leopard, it's more roundish, little splotches. Also, if you look at the leopard frog, again, the one on the left, you can see that there's green around the spots. So any leopard, all of the leopard frogs, I should say, have some green in them. Most of the times it's around the spots, but there's always going to be some green on that frog. Whereas the pickerel frog, you can see some green or maybe you don't. So in this one over here, it's more brownish and tan. The leopard frog is considered to be the frog that herpetologists or anybody trying to catch a frog really want to catch and can impress everybody else if they're able to catch it. It is one of the highest jumping frogs. So if you were to have a frog contest, this is the frog to be holding on to. The pickerel frog can be found more in meadows and kind of floodplain areas, so you're not necessarily going to find it in the water. And the pickerel frog also has, on its skin, it has secretions that can actually kill other frogs or other animals in captivity. Both of these frogs have a snore. The pickerel frog's snore is more raspy than the leopard frog. And with the leopard frog, there's always going to be some grunts. So we'll listen to both of these snoring type frogs. Here's the leopard frog first with a bunch of snores and grunts. Whoops. Let's just go back one. And now here comes the pickerel frog with those snores, and it's more raspy. And we don't hear as many grunts. Okay. So here's these two. And two more lookalikes, the American toad and the Fowler's toad. And again, in these pictures, they look a little bit, certainly they don't look as similar, but both of them will have those blotches. We're just not able to see it as well in this picture. The one on the left is the American toad. The one on the right is the Fowler toad. A way to tell the difference is looking at those blotches. And on the one on the right, we can see that we can count the warts in each of those little blotches or spots. So I'm looking at one and I can see at least 5 little warts in there. If there's 3 or more, it's a Fowler's toad. If there's 1 or 2 warts in one of those blotches, then it's the American toad. So best way to tell by just looking at them. The Fowler's toad is not found as readily in Massachusetts. It likes sandy soil, so the Connecticut River Valley is a great place for Fowler's toads. Also, southeastern Massachusetts and Cape Cod, where it's really sandy soils, would be good places for the Fowler's toads. Both of them color is almost like a reddish to black to kind of tannish color. So here is the American toad. So it's a long trill. The trill can go on for 15 seconds. And here comes the Fowler's. So it's a trill as well, and it's shorter than the American toads. Maybe about 4 to 6 seconds. Okay, and our very last frog, which is a toad, is the eastern spadefoot toad. This is the only one which is state listed on the endangered species list in Massachusetts. So it's threatened in our state. It's a relatively smooth skinned frog, and its name, spadefoot, is because its back feet are like a spade or a shovel. So it's very rare to see this frog. I have never seen this frog in the wild. I would certainly love to, but I've never had the opportunity to. If there's a predator that comes around, or if you're walking near it and it is able to tell your vibrations or feel your vibrations, it will immediately dig into the ground with its back or spade feet. And it also only comes out to breed in thunderstorms. So during thunderstorms, that's the time when we most often hear this frog. And its call, well, it's pretty hard to describe. Maybe like sheep. In fact, if you want to, after you hear this, if you want to put in the chat what you think this frog sounds like, that'd be great, because I have a hard time describing it. So that was the spadefoot toad. Okay, and let me just see what somebody put in the chat. Almost crow-like. Okay, that's true. Kind of like a duck. These are all good ways to describe it. I'll be using some of those in the future. Okay, so it is quiz time. I'm gonna play a call, and if you can just write in the chat what frog you think this is. So here comes the first one. Hint, hint, banjo. And I see green frog. Excellent. It is a green frog. Okay, here comes the next one. Notice the grunts. So it's a snore with grunts. And we have leopard frog, and that is absolutely right. I did see toad, and it can be confusing. I often can confuse them. Okay, but that is the leopard frog, grunts and snores. Okay, and here comes the next one. High-pitched, little frog, and everybody has peeper. Excellent. Okay, we're gonna move on. We have 3 more. Okay, here comes the next one. Whoops. Okay, I gave that one away. That is the spadefoot. Okay. Vernal pool frog, that sounds like a duck. I see wood frog, wood frog, wood frog. Wonderful. And there's our wood frog. And our last one. That deep, largest frog that lives in Massachusetts. And bullfrog. Very good. Okay. So sometimes it's easier to hear one species. We're going to, and that's what we were just doing, but sometimes if you're by a beautiful lake like this, you may be hearing several. So I'm going to ask you now to listen to the sound. This is the same sound that we heard at the very beginning, and see if you can either tell how many different frogs are calling, or if you know which ones they are, put it right in the chat. All right, you have it, 3 different ones, and they are the peeper, the green frog, and the gray tree frog. So excellent, everybody passed the test. So many of us certainly do love frogs, and unfortunately, the population of frogs worldwide is not doing great. So a third of them, remember there are about 500 species, and about a third of them are threatened. And most of that is due to habitat loss. So habitat loss is the #1 cause of endangered species. These days, climate change is also really having an effect. And because these frogs live in wetlands and depend on wetlands, and wetlands are often destroyed, unfortunately, that means that a lot of those frogs are in danger. In Massachusetts, we're really fortunate. Massachusetts actually had the first wetland protection laws, and our laws are really good. We can always get better. So there's some things here that you can do. So when frogs are crossing the roads, you can basically drive very carefully. There's some places, some towns, I think Robert mentioned that somebody was from Amherst, so they're probably familiar with Henry Street in Amherst, where they close the road and volunteers go and they help the amphibians cross the roads if they need to. I think in Concord, Mass, they were doing that as well. People have put signs up for warning drivers to go slow. People have gone out on those wet spring nights to make sure that people are not speeding, and to just warn them that the frogs are migrating. Some communities will close some of the roads by wetlands, which are really great things to do. I mentioned that Massachusetts has some great laws. We can always do better, but fortunately, those of us in Massachusetts are in a state where we really have done a lot of protection. Vernal pools, we talked about those temporary bodies of water that dry up during the springtime. So if you know you have a vernal pool near you, you can actually certify your vernal pool. It's a great thing to do if you have them in your schoolyard, in your backyard. If you go through a process in Massachusetts, it's with the state, what's called the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. And you can always get in touch with us at Mass Audubon. We can refer you to the right people, but you go out, you can listen. If you hear wood frogs calling during migration or spring migration, that's enough to certify that vernal pool and give it some protection. So a great thing that all of us can do. I mentioned tunnels and putting signs up. And then Robert mentioned that we were going to talk a little bit about something called Frogwatch USA. So Frogwatch is a citizen science program where anybody, you don't need to be a scientist, anybody can participate. And citizen scientists, people participating has been so valuable in terms of helping to protect not only frogs, but really anything in nature. So this particular program, Frogwatch, means that you would adopt an area, and it might be your backyard, again, it might be your schoolyard, but you would adopt an area and you would go visit that area. I think it's about 10 times during the breeding season, and you would be out for maybe 10 minutes and you would be listening to all of the different frog sounds that you hear, and then just writing down on a piece of paper what you're hearing and the intensity. Is it loud? Is it kind of quiet? And then recording the temperature, the weather, basically being a citizen scientist. So you're doing that and you're collecting all sorts of data, which is great. And by doing that, that goes into a big database, this Frogwatch database. Frogwatch is now The main site is in Akron, Ohio, but it's all online. So you can do this online, you can get online, and you can see all the information that other people have been recording. What does this do? It tells us about the species diversity. It tells us if we have any rare species. It also tells us if there's invasive ones that have come from other parts of the world that may be taking the territory or the habitat of our species. It shows us shifts in diversity of range and phenology. So with climate change, we're seeing a lot of changes. I mentioned that usually the wood frogs and the peepers were the very first frogs to call. And then it would be a little kind of slow over a month where you would have some of the others, maybe the leopard frog and then the green frog would come. But this year, it seemed like right after the peeper and the wood frog, they all came at once because it got so warm. So learning about things like this, changes in when they're calling. It serves to, by doing some research, you're able to help learn about wetlands and show whether wetlands are in danger. So it's all really, really great stuff that anybody can do. In Massachusetts, there's 3 places that are what's called certified to be doing in-person programs for Frogwatch. So we in the Connecticut River Valley, where I work at Arcadia, we're one of the sites. And what that means is that we can have people come in person. We can do a workshop on Frogwatch and to certify you. If you'd like to do this, you do need to be certified. So you could do it in person, or you could just go right online and take this course. It's a few hours. It's great for families, great for individuals, great for people of all ages. And what's really, really, really super exciting is that by listening to frogs, people discovered in 2018, just a few years ago, 6 years ago, people discovered a brand new species of frog. So we have our leopard frog is the northern leopard frog. There's a southern leopard frog that's found in New Jersey and down towards Georgia area. So there were some folks who heard in New Jersey, a different type of a frog. It kind of sounded like the Atlantic and the northern leopard. It sounded like the northern and southern leopard frogs, but it was different. So they caught it. And herpetologists, people who study reptiles and amphibians, they took this frog and they realized it was very different. They took some blood samples, and sure enough, it was a new species. Not only did they discover this new species right then and there in 2018, but they went back to their museum specimens from 1953. That's a long time ago. And they realized that a lot of the frogs that they had in their museum collection were this new one, the Atlantic coast leopard frog. So it really wasn't new. It was just newly discovered, and newly discovered only because people were paying attention to the sound. So with that, I think that is the very end of my slides. And I just want to encourage you again. I can't say enough for citizen science, just getting out there and learning about these species and nature in general. Nothing like being out there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And if you have any questions, I will be glad to try to answer them.
So folks, let's give Patti a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. And let's take approximately 10 minutes of audience questions. Joan would like to know, is there any way to attract a gray tree from, to your back deck, I think she's saying. So is there any way to attract a gray tree frog to the back of your deck? Is the gray tree frog a thing? Did you mention that one?
Yes, I did. Yes. So it's not like we can put out food or anything. And the gray tree frogs are pretty generalists in their habitat requirements. So if you have shrubbery, landscaping for wildlife, is another great thing to do for any type of animal. But the more natural your yard is, so having shrubs, having even higher grass would be a great way. If you mow your lawn too often, it's not going to encourage them. But putting some shrubs maybe near your porch or near your deck would be a good thing. Maybe having like a little water source. Sometimes people put it out for birds, but just having that, having shrubs, having native plants, all of that will really go far in attracting them. Oops, I think you're muted.
I am sorry, I muted myself.
Yeah.
Joan says, I live, I see people are trying to trick me with misspellings today, but I'm too good for that. I live near a pond and woods, and the frogs sing loudly from June through August, continuously throughout the night. They seem to sing in unison. Is that possible? I'm assuming they are gray tree frogs.
So yes, they do, depending on the species. So singing in unison is better. There's a lot more frogs, and they're able to really send their message out loud and clear to attract a female. Sometimes they'll take breaks. Number one, I'm sure they mean it, but also so that they're not on each other's territory. So you're hearing it in unison is great. That's a great observation.
And Andra says, sometimes the peepers near my house have a trilling peep. Why do they do that? We joke that they are either very fancy peepers or just quote unquote warming up their singing voices.
I like your fancy peepers. So that's that often it's the release call. So that peep, 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 that's basically the advertisement call. But when you hear, it's almost like a trill, like beep, 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 that's get off me. And it's release, and it's almost like a leave me alone. If it's a super long one, then I'm wondering if there's toads in there as well.
Jean asks, so the Audubon can help me certify my next door vernal pool for its protection. Does the Mass Audubon do that?
Well, we don't do that. We can give you the information. So if actually the information, if you just go to Mass Wildlife, and go to natural heritage. I'm going to actually write it in the chat. There's no space there. Natural. I might be giving you a run for your money and not being able to spell, Robert. Okay. So Mass Wildlife Natural Heritage, and I'm sorry I don't have the link, but if you just go right there, you can get the information you need. If you would like to give us a call, your local Audubon site, or you can, Robert can give you my email, and then I can also just give you the information that you need. And thank you for certifying your vernal pool.
Chris says you had an excellent talk and wants to know, when do most frogs feed?
When do they feed? Was that?
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So whenever they're active, whenever something comes towards them, so depending on the species, many of the tadpoles eat vegetation, although some certainly can eat anything in the water, little rotifers, little tiny microscopic critters, and most of the adults are carnivores. So if they're swimming around in the water, if a fly happens to come in their way, by then they're going to eat it. So really, whenever the opportunity strikes.
Bonnie asks, we have a backyard pool which is visited by frogs, but is chlorine bad for the frogs?
I would say it is. However, that said, I know many people who have had frogs that almost every day have to go out and clean the pools and of the frogs. So I think in a normal pool situation, if you're keeping your chlorine to the recommended amount. It's not going to kill most of the frogs. As long as you go out there and you rescue them every day. If it's a prolonged period where they're in there, it probably would harm them.
Got it. Julie asks, could you talk a little more about where frogs go when they hibernate and how they know to come out of hibernation? And how far do they go when they migrate in the spring?
Okay, so good question, and it's different for all species. So ones like the wood frog don't have to go too deep into the woods. They go into the forest. Others like the green frog, the bullfrog, they would actually go under the muck in the pond. So they're not actually going into the woods, but they're just kind of going into that pond muck. A lot of them will actually take oxygen down with them so that they're able to have that. Some of them are not actually true hibernators, so they might come out if they need oxygen during the winter time. So that's kind of where do they go in hibernation. Migration, it's usually not too far. So the toads are on land, and it's, I would say, within maybe a quarter of a mile or so their home range. Again, really depends on their species, but they're not going to go very far. The wood frogs, maybe a few 100 feet or so. So it really, again, depends on the species.
All right, so folks, we're going to start to wind things down. Helen wants to know, do you know of a way to help remember the different kinds of frog calls?
I would say not. What I would say, Helen, is there's only 10 of them, and depending if you live in Massachusetts, Helen. So that's a good thing. It's not like the birds where we have a whole bunch. So doing it kind of like in the way that I went through them. So the two toads that are sound alike, to me, it really helps to relate them to what's called mnemonics, relating it to something that I can think of. So the green frog and it's like a banjo. The wood frog is like a duck. So those are the ways that really help me. I think everybody learns differently, but those are ways that help me. And if you want, feel free. I can just send Robert a little note about the 10 frogs and what they sound like for me, or you can get it in the recording.
All right, I'm going to run through the chat real quick. These are mostly comments, but there's a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Chris says, excellent talk. Diane says, thank you. This was excellent. Pilar says, really fascinating. Kimberly says, great program. Elaine would like to know, do frogs eat mosquito larvae?
In the water, yes. So all mosquitoes are born in the water, some way, shape, or form. And frogs definitely would be eating it and getting very healthy some years on the mosquito larvae.
Louise says, thank you for an interesting program. Elaine asks, does a tadpole tail nourish it only after the legs develop or all the way through?
That's a good question, and I am not sure of the answer. So that is something that I will look up. My guess is that it's probably species specific, but thank you for bringing that to my attention, and I will definitely look that up.
David wants to know, do frogs sleep?
They do, but like a lot of animals, it's not like going into, good night, going into a deep sleep. So it's being less active and being very aware around you.
Frank says, bravo. Brian says, thank you. Pilar says they sell pads to attach to outdoor pools to help frogs get out of the water and save themselves.
Interesting.
Mindy asks, are there any apps for frog sounds like there are for bird sounds, such as Merlin? I am challenged at recognizing sounds, and Merlin helps me so much with birds.
I haven't heard of an app, but there is a website, and I want to say it's National Wildlife Federation. Robert, if I send it to you, do you have everybody's, you're going to be sending evaluation, so
Yeah,
could you
if you could send it by 5 o'clock today, that would be great, Patty.
Okay, so I will send it by 5 o'clock, and
And
it
Patty, when
is,
you retire from Mass Audubon, you and I, we're going to go into a partnership. Okay, I'm going to develop an app. You're going to help me for frog songs, frog calls. Okay.
that sounds great, but I'm not going to help you when it comes to the technology.
No, you'll help me with the knowledge, though.
Yes.
So Margot says, very interesting. Thank you, Patty. Kimberly wants to know, how high in trees do gray tree frogs go?
I would say maybe about 30, 50 feet. And a lot it's just in shrubs, so a lot of times it's not that high. But I don't think there's a specific number, but usually in shrubs.
Margot wants to know, do frogs eat each other's eggs?
They
do frogs
certainly
eat other frogs' eggs?
Yeah, they certainly could. Yeah, they certainly could. Somebody also I just saw, I think Elaine just put identifier, and I actually have that. Can you see this, Robert?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a very simple thing. I had this as a backup just in case my sounds weren't going to come across on the computer, but this is something called bird song identifier. So people could actually put that. I mean, that's something that you could learn your sounds with as well. And I'll include that in the email to Robert.
Patty, I think I just made you full screen. Why don't you hold it up one more time?
Okay.
All right, excellent. Okay, I'm back. So we have 2 more comments. We've got Nancy says this was great, nice presentation. Larry says very clear and informative presentation. Thank you. Helen says thank you for the very nice presentation. Frank says great presentation. All right, Patty, we're going to wrap it there. It is a little bit past 3:10. Let's give Patty a big virtual round of applause. Wonderful job as always, Patty. I'm basically doing monthly programs with the Mass Audubon, so perhaps our paths will cross again in a few months. But I do want to again thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library. And we also had several libraries partner with Tewksbury, help promote today's program. Those libraries include Amherst, Carlisle, West Newbury, Groton, Greenfield, and Wayland. So we thank those libraries so much. If I missed any, I don't think I missed any, but if I did, I apologize. Any last words from you, Patty?
Thank you all for coming. Get out, listen to frogs. And thank you, Robert.
All right. Thanks so much, Patty.
Okay,
I hope
take
everyone
care.
enjoys
Bye-bye.
the rest of their day. Have a good one, everyone. Bye-bye.